Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Reroll Zero, and I'm a writer that wants to be published. I figured our first episode or my first podcast would be about a subject that everybody can learn or talk about. So I would say that our first subject today would be about Star Wars Battlefront 2. It had its last update maybe I think 2-3 weeks ago, and I think just in general, there should be a bigger or better response for releasing games, that are halfway done. And Star Wars Battlefront 2 started out very much like that. I guess a good thing to start off with was being like, where these games came from and, how did we get here? And, I think one way to start that off would be to say Star Wars Battlefront 1, which started off with a development company called Pandemic. Pandemic was, I think, originally under the arm of Activision, then because I think they made a couple of like third-party titles, essentially. I think it was a mech video game, if I'm not mistaken, and so after that they kind of got their past their first video games developed, and then they got contracts for Star Wars Battlefront 1 and Mercenaries and a couple other titles that they developed. And it was, even though you could say for all their third person shooter titles, they or third person camera titles, that they could have just been very lazy, because nothing's too different about all three of them. Specifically, what's it called? Star Wars Battlefront, Mercenaries, and the other one. But at the same time, they were consistent, and consistency is good, especially in a time where, spontaneity is not good when developing a video game, especially if it's like a big budget release. Regardless, big budget release or indie, it doesn't matter. It just, you have to be consistent with your updates and make sure that that you consistently deliver on your product. One thing I will say is that, so when they developed Star Wars Battlefront 1, it was a good okay to average to good, meaning the concept is there, of story mode, a slight story mode, the idea of classes to pick which have specific jobs, and the concepts are there. The graphics don't look super great, especially for a original Xbox and PlayStation 2 title, specifically when I think Metal Gear Solid 2 debuted before that, or about the same time. And I know it's kind of unfair to say like not a AAA title, but like a big budget title compared to something that could have been indie, or even though it has the Star Wars name and contract to it, that may not be a big budget game compared to Rogue Squadron at the time, which Rogue Squadron was at its second game, more or less. So the graphics are alright compared to its competition, and then 4 years later, their second game comes out, Star Wars Battlefront 2. It's much better. The controls I don't remember, but the graphics are much better. They either saw that before, or just were very committed to make the graphics better. There are selectable heroes, which if you get enough points, you can play as or with that character or whatever, such as like Darth Maul or Obi-Wan or something like that. And then it's kind of awful because they were both released, because it's a multi-platform title. They were both released near the time when new consoles, I think like 2005, were about to come out, like Xbox 360 and PS3, and at least for the Wii, I remember I think Wii was coming out around like 2006, 2007. And then with that mentality, so it kind of only had like a couple of years before the new systems came out, and I know it doesn't matter with PC because PC is kind of a general idea or a general like platform of improvement or whatever, but uh they they didn't have as much of like time to be on like Xbox Live or the PSN network or whatever to have more time with their title, like gosh, what's it called, Halo 2 released in 2004, so at least at the very least it had 2-3 years before the advent of the new consoles came out, and you wanted to switch out to another um part of the franchise. So, and then Pandemic, unfortunately, after that time, gets bought out by EA, and same thing with BioWare. BioWare got bought out by EA at the time as well. And EA has them make Mercenaries 2 and a couple other games, and then they kind of have the development company fold. And that's unfortunate because, if they're doing all right, or, if they're doing okay, then you have no reason at all to shut them down. So Pandemic should shut down, and in the meantime, what happened between them them being shut down and them not developing Star Wars Battlefront? There's 2 Star Wars Battlefront games for handheld consoles, and I don't remember when they released. But I think it was called Star Wars Rebellion or Star Wars something of that nature. Yeah, that's a great title. What was interesting about it, it had like 2 hero vehicles, like the Millennium Falcon, I think the Slate 1 or something like that. I think like there was a Bosk, I think, as a hero or something like that. And it was probably the most interesting aspect. They had a create your own character segment, which they put that in the Star Wars Battlefront 1 made by EA in, I can't think of the year, 2014, 2015. Anyway, what I was going to say is, so the PSP game had a lot of interesting ideas. Unfortunately, it was also on a handheld system, so it was great for, like pretty much Japan and some people with handhelds in the USA. But again, it didn't have the multi-platform release as the similar title, so it kind of, I would imagine, it didn't do as well as it wanted to be. Then there was another handheld title that was for the Nintendo DS, and I think it's the same problem with the PSP title that was only released on one system, so you only got comments from one source or one direction, so you couldn't get as many helpful reviews, positive and negative, to correlate what you wanted to do with your with the next game. So I remember seeing the PSP one or the PlayStation Portable one, and I was sad, I was disappointed because why only release on handheld or something like that, or it's like I think almost a problem like what's it called, Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, where it was released on handheld initially, and then it arrived in the Metal Gear Solid HD collection, and I imagine anthology for PS3 and PS4 or PS3, and seeing a game like that on a console is absolutely amazing. I wish more companies put their handheld games on consoles. Like, thinking about Nintendo, they started to do that with the Wii U, but not enough Wii U or not enough handheld games for the Wii U console. So unfortunately for that, I think the LucasArts employed at the time, LucasArts didn't do that, and so we're seeing, and recently we're only seeing them come back, all those wonderful or weird Star Wars games on Origin for some reason, and like a couple other like places where digital storefronts are. And sorry, I was getting a little bit distracted. What I should say is now skip ahead a couple of years from those 4 games to Star Wars Battlefront 1. Star Wars Battlefront 1 was it was different. I didn't like it. It was great because it had the like the created character thing from the PSP game, like I mentioned previously. It the gameplay itself, it was a little bit iffy. I tried returning to it before I had before gosh, I'm trying to think of it. Anyway, I tried it a little bit at, when I started streaming on Mixer a little bit. I think 2-3 years ago, and the load times are awful, and that's probably the biggest takeaway. Other than that, they did their like homework on the graphics. The graphics are amazing, but unfortunately, that's kind of where the good and bads or stop. Is that the graphics are amazing, but there's not too much else look in the game. There are co-op missions which they put in the game, which are a good idea, but they don't lend themselves to having you play them too much, and that's unfortunate. So, again, that's a good idea, but not done well. So after 2-3 years, they come back to the table, and then they release Star Wars Battlefront 2, and you can't mention those accursed words that every review starts off with, because it's absolutely awful. Nobody, I swear, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to read about it, because so many interviews or reviews, for that matter, focus on those words specifically, and that's what your mind is the whole time. You're like, well, what about it? It doesn't exactly have an effect on the game, and a lot of the time people are saying that because, again, they're not playing the game enough. So, or again, they're having somebody that plays too much, and they have an unfair advantage anyway. So I understand the need for them to put that issue in the spotlight, but for right now, you can't mention those accursed words. Those accursed words they're absolutely annoying, and they don't need to be present. So yeah, Star Wars Battlefront 2, that was another one that was incredibly annoying part of Star Wars Battlefront 1 that EA made. There was no campaign, and so Star Wars Battlefront 2, when it released, it had a campaign. So that was a step in the right direction. The campaign character, Iden Versio, is actually a great character. Unfortunately, they added DLC, which kind of makes it a moot point. They introduced a character, and then they removed said character all in one go, and that's unfortunate too. So they had Iden Versio, which is a good idea, and then it's unfortunate too because they also made the character of like almost really generic, unfortunately, because they had the great sense of making this character, but they didn't want to give them too much, I guess, autonomy for other, I think, studios or media companies to make a better idea or version of that character. Like the vehicle that Iden is associated with in both the multiplayer and the campaign is a TIE fighter, but the TIE fighter only has 3 red stripes on one of the wings, or gosh, I can't think, basically the wing. And so I was thinking, why didn't they have her fly a unique winged vehicle instead of a generic vehicle with just a slight paint job to mark it as being different. That kind of, that's one thing that was bad. Another thing is that it's great that in the campaign you can choose whatever weapon that you want pertaining to the situation, but the fact that all the concept art, all the screens, and in game she only has one weapon, but you can, as a general class, you can use that weapon as well. So that's another mark, unfortunately. So a generic vehicle with only a slight difference, a generic weapon, um, and I think that almost even pertains even to merch as well, which is unfortunate because if you look on Amazon, they're just the package is marked Inferno Soldier, which is Aiden's like group or like yeah, special group. So they didn't even want to like I don't know give her special attention or whatever because yeah, it's there's a lot of things which it was good that they made an original or unique character, but it was like two things in game and another third one outside, and like a couple others, but it's hard to determine that. I think the last thing that you could say that EA did that like undermines the character a lot is that she has a special droid with her, and she uses it to stun enemy troopers or to disable stuff. And unfortunately, she just calls the droid. So they didn't even give her. They didn't give the droid a unique moniker or idea, so that it just kind of comes off feeling hollow and almost, I would say, lazy because they didn't give enough of a distinction to the droid or her character, or just something that would have been better overall. Because but they gave her so much generic stuff that the protagonist feels cheapened. It feels like it feels like I think the idea of it, as it were, it was I think it was going to be a good idea that having it be kind of like a generic trooper, but at the same time, um, you know that's what I think. Or one fifth thing and one final thing now I think about it is there are all the levels are kind of designed, where they're kind of like Call of Duty, where they're kind of where they're kind of just short, and that's another problem. I feel like it hurt the game so much, and probably why Star Wars Fallen Order, the next game, not by Dice, not by Motive, not by the lots of companies that went to work on the game, but by a single development company. That's why Star Wars Fallen Order was such a big deal, because it's not like missions are, or the game is not a mission. It's open ended. You can go wherever you want. And again, with Star Wars Battlefront 2, that's not a case. Again, missions are structured like Call of Duty or Battlefront, where they're just, you don't do too much in them. Just it's just like action set pieces where lots of great crazy things happen, but you're not at liberty to find them out on your own. You're on pretty much a rail. Like it's a rail shooter, but you have the slight mobility that you want or need. Kind of almost like even if you go so far as to like Halo or Gears of War or something like that, where you can still move around, but when the story is happening, they want you to notice. So anyway, specifically speaking, there's a lot of problems with the campaign. It's a good starting point, but unfortunately, hopefully they make a better attempt if Star Wars Battlefront 3 is a possibility, but I'm not entirely sure. So continuing off of that, Star Wars Battlefront 2 had a campaign. There's a lot of flaws, but at the same time, if there are no flaws, then nothing's wrong with the game, and why are you bringing it up? Or you can say it's awesome fully, or it's fully awesome. Again, for this one, which was another good point that they brought up, is that they had more characters not from. That's what I was gonna say. Star Wars Battlefront 1 was good in the sense, or Star Wars Battlefront 1 from EA was good in the sense that they added a lot of characters that even Pandemic didn't have a chance to create. Like they had Lando Calrissian, they had Nien Nub, they had Greedo, they had Dengar. They had a lot of characters which either Pandemic didn't have a chance to develop assets for them, or textures or models for them, or they just didn't care. And both Star Wars Battlefront 1 and 2, a lot of people, now that I think about it, they said that, oh, they were lazy because there's only 4 weapons for each class. And at the same time, well, I'm going like, yeah, but Pandemic also was lazy because so many characters have the same model or same weapon, like Boba Fett. Boba Fett has the same blaster rifle and the same flamethrower, and it's the same model. And and a lot of heroes and villains in Star Wars Battlefront 2 made by Pandemic have a lot of carryovers. Like Han Solo has the like C4 esque weapon that the engineer has, like, so you can call them out for being lazy. And I feel like, again, it's a very much nostalgia thing with the older ones, with Pandemic ones, because you don't want to be negative towards the old ones because you have such you just have such an admiration of them, but at the same time, you need to say something, like you should be able to say these things without being so affected, because sure, EA was lazy, but Pandemic was just lazy as well. So there's precedent for these things. Don't get super angry. The other thing I was gonna say is, so from them kind of being lazy for Star Wars Battlefront 2, I can't go on more about it besides the launch, because the launch is what I want to go on and talk about. Again, there's a campaign, there's multiplayer, there's heroes versus villains, and that was another good part of the game, that they didn't just focus on the galactic whatever era that the first game focused on, with only characters from that era. So for this game, you have like Yoda and like Darth Maul, which is cool. So the other thing is, or it's like you have Darth Maul and you have like young Obi-Wan or whatever. So for like 2 different examples, I guess. But anyway, so that's another like boon. And that kind of, and there's arcade, which arcade is not a bad idea, but I remember the initial AI, or the initial CPU or robot or whatever you want to call it, it was very poor, and it was hard to have a good experience of the mode, because since the AI was so poor, it was hard to have that idea of like it being really fun. Like, I get it, it's kind of like an arcade experience, like most Sega games were, or like Capcom or whatever, but it's Sega, it's like an arcade experience, but at the same time, it kind of just leaves itself there. So again, there's campaign, multiplayer, arcade, and that's it for the 3 modes. Because again, and Starfighter Assault, and that's why I think Star Wars Battlefront 2 had been dealt such a bad hand, was that there were like 4 development companies, or at least EA was a publishing one, then DICE was the main development one, then Criterion, which was, they made, I think, the Burnout series. They made, what's it called? Like 3, or, they handled or sorry, not 3, I don't know what I was going to say right there. They had, they handled the Starfighter segments, and unfortunately, that's one other thing about the campaign. There's not enough Starfighter segments. There should have been way more of those. But Criterion handled I think the Starfighter segments for multiplayer and the campaign probably. And there was another company called Motive, and I don't know what Motive did. Motive was another like company they just created for Star Wars stuff, and I didn't know why or what their job was. So, unfortunately, from all of this, they fired. I remember it was a story that I didn't think about too much, but Criterion was fired, or at least removed from the project. So the Starfighter updates were pretty much null and void, except for the first update, or first or second update, which gave out the space battleground of Dakar or whatever. And that's it, if I remember correctly. So there was only one space map update, and yeah, so that was unfortunate. I don't know what Motive did, but I imagine that they more or less face a similar fate. I don't know. I imagine again, like Dice is still probably still fine or good because they didn't have so much backlash, and again they have Battlefield to go or to work on again. So, um, but anyway, unfortunately, it released. It was it was a marked improvement from Star Wars Battlefront One. While unfortunately removing a lot of the character creation aspects, they did eventually. But again, it was it was it was they took too much time to release said updates, and that was another significant thing. But it was at a this. I'm still wanting to talk about launch. I don't want to make Star Wars Battlefront look better because and again, same thing with older games too that had that launched halfway done. I want them to be released as full fledged games instead of you know charging subsequently for the next game after that with the newest class or the newest classes or the newest maps or something like that. They need to stop doing that. And yeah, so Star Wars Battlefront 2, it came out. Again, it's still not. I think people make the word bad to, or they make it seem worse than it is, and it wasn't. It was average to good. It was probably honestly good to better. It was a marked improvement. They included that campaign, which was much better than last time. And this is a word to Call of Duty: don't ever, don't don't forget to put in a campaign, Call of Duty, because that was a big detriment to Black Ops 4. Um, it has multiplayer and it has an arcade mode, which I know last further installments down the line included the instant action slash the offline modes that you really wanted to play, but it was not initially in the game at all. But again, like, we can't focus on that. We got to focus on the launch game itself. But again, like, again with the launch, I want to focus on just games. If they didn't have any other updates, how would the game be? And like, again, like I was saying, and even if they say, like, with said updates, like, oh, we just it was they just thought of it right there. No, they've been planning this for eons. They just been waiting for it to drag it out the experience as much as possible, because that's how they know to survive. If you release a full game with all of its intended features, then it's initially played, then forgotten about. So yeah, so that's why they want to put as many updates out and drag it out as much as possible, which pretty much how all of social media slash YouTube works, Twitch, Mixer, whatever, because people crave consistency. People crave more updates for their favorite games. So Star Wars Battlefront 2 came and went, and again, I cannot stress this enough. Video games need to be released fully done. I know it's like people want these things to last forever, but it's a good idea to say, when does something end on a high note? When does something end in a good way? You don't want to be Simpsons over here with 30 plus years, and they're clearly not out of ideas, but I think they lost their passion for it. They lost their they kind of just see it as a job versus something that they want to work on. So and that, unfortunately, that influenced Star Wars Fallen Order, because probably people picked up Star Wars Fallen Order and assumed, okay, this game's going to be absolutely terrible, but it wasn't. It was actually a great marked improvement in the eyes of EA published different company developed games. So Again, I wish it was more complete when it released. I can't speak about, all the updates because, again, all the updates improve the game every now and then. I feel like, again, Finn and Phasma should not have been part of the um, crate update in Star Wars Episode 8 because it just seemed super awkward with the beta that John Boyega or whatever, he said, like, oh, welcome to Star Wars Battlefront 2, but I'm not in the game yet, so it just sounds awkward. Um, and same thing with Phasma. I think they struggled so much to deal or to develop for her a significant move list or move type, and they still struggled super hard. It's like seeing Marvel Heroes, or Marvel Heroes Omega, whatever you want to call it, and see like characters like Colossus one. I think Kitty Pryde is one where they and gosh, I'm trying to think of other characters that they struggle with moves super hardcore. Um, where it's like Colossus has like 4 or 3 assists or whatever, and it just kind of like it's goofy because again like they really struggle with Colossus' moveset because like what else are you gonna do with a guy that has, you know, armor or whatever? And I looking at Marvel Heroes to like same thing with like Kitty Pryde. It's like Kitty Pryde in the sense of like X-Men Legends too, and like that's why she was probably passed over so much because it's like how do you make this character have a moveset and how to make them um a good character to play with and as. And they have her in Marvel Heroes, and a lot of her moves are just they either don't make sense or they're really like underwhelming. So that's what I'm saying. Like, oh, they struggled with Phasma, and I almost feel like they struggled with Finn too because he only has a blaster, and like two of his moves are mostly better for you know the game modes in the for Star Wars Battlefront 2. For Galactic Assault or Capital Supremacy or whatever. Um, and same thing with Phasma. Phasma has a turret, the turret's the most confusing thing ever, and the combat baton from Star Wars Episode 8. So and a heal for her as well. So I think they struggle a lot. I think again too so I think they should have been initially added to the game instead of the Star Wars Episode 8 update to the game. I think uh, just they should have had they should have had a better idea of how to go about making sure that the game is fully tested, fully ready to go. And they didn't, and their work shows, and it's unfortunate because again um I know this is probably another random thing to consider, but it's like I remember sometimes some YouTubers talked about how each how most movie games were absolutely awful, and that the developers themselves either had an impossible job to do, or they just that was their contract, so this is the end result. And so again, either the game is awful because they didn't care, or they did not have a significant time to develop it in a short period of time, And from that, it's just, I think Star Wars Battlefront 2 is kind of that. It's a bad movie game, but also it it is passable enough so that it is it's not as bad as game as it could have been. Like, if they didn't have the flight segments or whatever, it could have been worse. If it didn't have, the campaign, it would have been worse. And even if they did, even if they removed both of those features and focused on the rest of the game, it still would have been just as bad. So the good thing is, it's not as bad as people say. It's just, it's passable to average to good to better. So this is definitely a marked improvement, and hopefully with Star Wars Battlefront 3 or Star Wars I don't know what the next one's gonna be. If it's gonna be Fallen Order 2 or another unique IP or another new property within the Star Wars universe. I don't know what's gonna happen, and I can't say whether or not it'd be good to to kind of try and like figure out what's the next thing gonna be. Anyway, sorry, I rambled on a lot about Star Wars Battlefront 2. But if you like this at all, or if you like the podcast at all, thank you for listening. I don't know how long I'm gonna work on it, but this was different to record instead of just recording video games like with Twitch or Mixer. So I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and this is Reroll Zero signing off.